Hey there, Mazzy here. It's the Music Stupid number 25, a whole quarter century of It's the Music Stupid, at least the number 25. Five records, that's it. And five records I love, I pull from my collection that I want to kind of talk about, introduce you to. And as I roll these out, they aren't necessarily the best albums from these artists. And I think all these, all these records today, I have many by these artists. So these are just ones that have been on my mind lately. And this first one is the debut album of the band Little Feat out of Los Angeles. Lil George and Roy Estrada were in the Mothers. And there's so many kind of stories. And what's the real story? Are they rumors about Lil George leaving the Mothers of Invention and Frank Zappa suggesting he goes on his own? He did turn them on to Warner Brothers Records, and they got their record contract. And this is their debut album. This is unique because this has a photograph on the cover, and all their subsequent albums had neon park illustrations, some really kind of wild illustrative images, which, go search out, and maybe in future episodes I will showcase, or maybe even do a feature on Little Feat, because I love this band. They lasted really from 1969 to 1979 in their first incarnation while Lil George was alive. They reformed in the late 80s, but I didn't follow them as much, although they were quite good. I only saw them once, and around the time of their great live album, Waiting for Columbus, one of the best rock and roll live albums of the 1970s. But that's another discussion for another day. The other rumor was that Lil George wrote the song Willin' that Frank Zappa heard. He wanted to use it in the Mothers, possibly, and Frank Zappa either thought the song was too good, so he shouldn't be in the band, or he didn't like the drug reference in it. Weed, whites, and wine, and show me a sign. Willin' has become sort of an anthem of road songs, of truck driving, like a country song. Little Feat recorded it twice, first on this album, then I think it was on Dixie Chicken, a different version, different arrangement of it. On this version, Ry Cooder plays bottleneck guitar. And Lil George is no slouch. Apparently he had damaged his hand. But Ry Cooder's on 2 or 3 tracks on this. This was produced by Russ Titelman, who ironically, I don't know at this point, probably by this point, but around this time, was Ry Cooder's brother-in-law. Ry Cooder's wife is Susan Titelman, a photographer and a sister of Russ Titelman. That gets in a whole different direction. But this stuff I know because I'm so much into Ry Cooder. But what's great about Little Feat, they were sort of this rockish country, but almost very rootsy, very gospel-y like. Almost not sounding from Los Angeles, almost sounds like they're from the Southwest, possibly even Texas. Roy Estrada from the Mothers left, I believe, after the second album. But Truck Stop Girl on here is a fantastic song. I mentioned Willing. Again, Willing became this great song covered by so many people, including C-Train, and one of my favorite vocal versions of that is Linda Ronstadt's version on Heart Like a Wheel. Apparently, the reason they spelled feet, like F-E-A-T, was surprisingly, and I only learned this about a decade or two ago. It's like either 10 or 20 years, but not back in the day, because of the Beatles, because the Beatles spelling B-E-A-T with Beatles, so F-E-A-T. I mean, it seems kind of a strange thing. They don't have any, there's no real Beatle influence there, aside from, they really kind of put their first album out when the Beatles were splitting up. But an amazing discography, Little Feat, and Lil George was just a great singer and a great arranger, great songwriter, great player. Bill Payne on piano. I mean, the whole band, really tight musicians. Next, I want to go on something completely different, and this is the debut album by Nina Simone. This is an original mono Bethlehem album. There is an analog production, a stereo album, which is very good. Some people aren't into the wide panning, but I don't mind it as much as some folks. This is a little noisy, but we're not talking about the music, not the sound of it. Nina Simone, classically trained pianist, did some demo work, really into blues and gospel. Obviously became a real pioneer and very articulate and into the civil rights movement of the 1960s and even into the 1970s. Wrote some amazing songs, Young, Gifted, and Black. But this debut is a perfect album. Recorded in 1957, but for some reason was postponed, didn't come out till 1959, so about a year and a half, 2 years after it was recorded. I think since she had left Bethlehem and gone to Cool Picks Record. Had some kind of semi-pop hits at the time, but this finally caught on. She opens up with a great cover of Mood Indigo. Little Girl Blue on here is great. My Baby Just Don't Care For Me. Love Me or Leave Me is one of my favorite songs on this album. Of course, there's an amazing documentary on Nina Simone. It's Seek It Out. Tempestuous life, later diagnosed bipolar, but a great, great bluesy, jazzy, soulful, gospel-y piano player and musician. So Little Girl Blue, Nina Simone, her debut album. Wonderful, wonderful record. UK band, an important band, and they're always put in this weird category of art rock, of pop, and they have sort of these literally two different directions, and that's the debut album by 10cc, and this is including the hit Rubber Bullets. This is their first album that came out in this country on London Records, UK Records, part of London Records. Now, this is in a way, they're a bipolar band, or I should say they have two distinctly different segments. After the fact, and a few years later, they almost became like 5C, you could say, because they split off into two camps. There's the very pure pop songwriters in Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman. Of course, Graham Gouldman was a real hit maker and a real songsmith, and songs for the Yardbirds, For Your Love, No Milk Today for Herman's Hermits. Just a lot, so many songs you've heard in the 1960s he wrote. And Eric Stewart was the original member of Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders, Groovy Kind of Love. He sings on that. Once Wayne Fontana literally walked out in the group, he was in the Mindbenders. They dropped that name, of course, Hooked Up here, and Kevin Godley and Lol Creme, the other half. In a way, they were the more artsy, creative, experimental side, and they really fused well together. Manchester band, had a studio outside of Manchester. I think Eric Stewart owned it and was the engineer there for some time. Strawberry Studios, where most of their records. Now, this record, they got a very beautiful vocal style, and what's great about it, all the members play multi-instruments, so extremely talented band. Of course, Eric Stewart was more the engineer, the audio studio maven at this point, but they would really, grow and expand. Of course, most people know who don't follow 10cc, I'm Not in Love, which came out literally around the same time, months apart from Bohemian Rhapsody, and has that multi-layered of beautiful recorded vocals. And they didn't have that frontman like a Freddie Mercury. This record sported, I believe, 3 top 10 hits, and one of the hits, Rubber Bullets, went #1 in the UK. Here, a lot of critics, I think, and some fans thought it too poppy, too twee, little glam, but more in a lot of Beach Boy influences here, but really great. And also there was a little bit of this retro 50s kitsch where someone thought it was almost like, that's not what's happening in 1973. We want, harder rock, Led Zeppelin, rock and roll, prog music, singer-songwriter. This almost didn't find an audience, at least in America, until later with I'm Not in Love, and of course, when they split off in 2 camps, songs like Dreadlock Holiday and Mandy Fly Me. That was actually all 4 of them, I believe. Rubber Bullets on here, as I said, Donna, the Godley Creme song, which ironic, Godley Creme being so esoteric and so experimental. That's that kind of a going back to the 50s pop rock and roll, almost like the Beatles in Oh, darling, in that kind of 50s sort of doo-woppy type of song. Great record, but very poppy, very art rock-like, very commercial. And I think they're one of the great bands that, you know, they get lumped into the ELO without all the same commercial success as ELO. But I think they're definitely more original. And it wasn't just like Jeff Lynne plus everybody else. This was an equal opportunity band in 10cc. And of course, apparently 10cc, they got the name from the average amount of male ejaculation. Is that true? Some scientist, doctor can tell me, some sex therapist. Oh, okay, that's their first album from 73, but I wanted to show this. This isn't one of the 5, but this is Hot Legs. This is the band that they did, and they had one sort of a radio hit called Neanderthal Man, which is great. And it just has this, like, droning drum thing. I'm a Neanderthal man. Da, 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 da. And it has all the members again, but I think it was Graham Gouldman is only on part of this. He was kind of coming in. It was the first 3, Godley and Creme and Eric Stewart are really the main part of Hot Legs. Of course, they would change the name and update themselves in 1972, 73. So this is a fantastic record. This cover, I believe, is before... Isn't Alice Cooper who copied this cover? I think so. Am I wrong about that? Although I love their first album the best, this is no slouch, and it's a fantastic album. The LA punk band X, this is their second album, Wild Gift, also produced by Ray Manzarek, who produced their first album, of course, the keyboard player for The Doors. The first album is one of the great LA punk records, and what I think was interesting about X, you know, if you have to put them and compare them to all the other punk bands out of LA or San Francisco at that time, even New York, they had this more organic rockabilly sound, you know, beat poetry thing happening. Billy Zoom, when I used to see them play, he's their guitar player, almost didn't fit in. He would just like have this big smile on his face playing, but he was so good. Bone Break on drums. You have, of course, Exene Cervenka and John Doe, who the primary songwriters on guitar and vocals. And they had a really interesting harmony together. Exene doesn't have this great, beautiful voice, but it really works, especially in tandem with John Doe, who's got this sort of mid-level, not quite a baritone, but tenor maybe, but a little lower, you know. But they got this country feel to it, rockabilly thing. I mean, there definitely was a whole punk scene that crossed over even in the UK with Clash and so many other bands crossing over in the rockabilly scene there. But this is a great album. You know, maybe it's a little more in the rockabilly, a little more country influences. Of course, they would do a side project a little later, The Knitters, which is more of a folky, rootsy thing with one of the members of the Blasters, Dave Alvin, of the Blasters, who were around this time doing that kind of more rockabilly sound, coming out of the punk new wave scene as well. But Wild Gift, the song White Girl on Here, just a great song. You know, it's very accessible. It's so funny, like, you know, 50 years later, or whatever this is, 40 years later, I think it was 81, I believe this album came out. 40 plus years later, this seems so tame compared to what it seemed to be at the time in the early 80s. But X is one of my favorite bands. I like everything they do. I probably saw them more than a dozen times in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the early 80s. One of several of the last shows I saw before lockdown here. Just a great band. This is, their second album, Wild Gift, X, LA band. And lastly, I want to close out with a great soundtrack that Ry Cooder created with other musicians I'll get into in a minute for Walter Hill's film, The Long Riders. I believe Ry did more soundtracks with Walter Hill, the director, than any other film. Johnny Handsome, The Border. Did he do The Border? Was that Walter Hill? Anyway, he's done so many records. This is probably my favorite. It has the great Jim Dickinson on piano and harmonium throughout. Wonderful guitar playing, mandolin, fiddles by Just recently, we lost David Lindley, is all over this record. Milt Holland on percussion, and a lot of other artists. And it has a real cowboy feel. It's music that really is an integral part of the film. I think Walter Hill did this film around 1980. And what's brilliant about it is it's about all these outlaws, obviously in the Wild West. And all the actors and the outlaws are played by brothers, like the Jesse James brothers, and et cetera, et cetera. But you got David Carradine and Keith Carradine and Robert Carradine, 3 brothers playing brothers. James Keach and Stacy Keach, the same. You got Dennis Quaid and Randy Quaid. And then you got Christopher Guest and Nicholas Guest. And of course, Christopher Guest, we all know from the director and from Spinal Tap and the director of all his movies like Best in Show and everything. So I love the idea of brothers playing brothers. There is some kind of segments of dialogue and around campfire type things overlapping some of these great songs. But this is a fantastic, rootsy acoustic record. Probably my favorite of the soundtracks of Ry Cooder. The Long Rider, 1980, Long Riders, 1980, music composed and arranged by Ry Cooder. So that's the music. Stupid, 5 albums that I just adore, and I gave you a little background. So check one or all of them out, or let me know what you think and what you like about these records, or not. Mazzy loves you.